I still remember the exact moment Richard Morrison decided I wasn't worth his respect. It was my first day at Caldwell & Associates, one of the most prestigious consulting firms in Manhattan, and I was standing in that gleaming marble lobby wearing my best navy suit, the one I'd saved 3 months to buy. I'd worked my entire life for this opportunity, 4 years at Howard, 2 more getting my MBA at Wharton, then another 3 years grinding it out at a smaller firm to build my portfolio. This job was supposed to be my arrival, my moment to finally sit at the big table. Richard was my new boss, senior partner, 48 years old with that perfectly styled silver hair and those impossibly white teeth. The kind of man who's never had a reason to doubt himself in his entire life. He walked right past me that first morning without even a glance. His Italian leather shoes making that clicking sound on the marble floor. His assistant, this young white woman named Melissa, gave me this sympathetic little smile. I knew right then. She'd seen this before. The morning briefing was in conference room A. I got there early, notebook ready, prepared to make an impression. I'd spent the entire weekend reviewing the client portfolio they'd assigned me. When Richard walked in, he barely acknowledged the other 4 associates already sitting there. His eyes swept the room and landed on me. Not with curiosity, not with welcome, with assessment. Like he was trying to figure out if I belonged there or not. He told me I must be Jasmine, barely glancing at his tablet. I stood up, extended my hand, told him it was an honor to be there, mentioned that I'd been following his work on the Reinhardt acquisition, that the way he structured that deal was absolutely brilliant, trying to show him I'd done my homework, that I knew my stuff. He shook my hand like he was afraid he might catch something. You know that limped handshake some people give when they don't really want to touch you? Yeah, that one. Then he came out with it. Said they were very committed to diversity at Caldwell, that I'd find them very inclusive. The way he said the word diversity made my stomach drop, like it was charity, like I was there to fill a quota instead of being a consultant who'd been recruited by 3 different firms. I tried to push back a little, told him I was actually recruited based on my track record, that last year I'd led the Morehouse deal that generated $42 million in revenue for my previous firm. Real numbers, real results. He just brushed it off, said something about how we'd see how I did with real pressure, already turning away from me, already done with the conversation. The meeting continued and Richard started outlining the quarterly goals. When he got to client assignments, he rattled off names and projects for everyone else. Complex mergers, multi-million-dollar portfolios. Marcus Chen, another associate who started the same day as me, got assigned a $12 million portfolio right there on the spot. When Richard got to me, he paused, like he had to think about what to do with me. He told me to start by just observing for the first few weeks. Said I should get coffee for the team meetings, take notes, learn how they did things there, learn how real consultants operated. The room went completely silent. Marcus looked at me with this expression that was half pity, half relief that it wasn't him getting humiliated. I kept my voice real careful and told Richard I had 8 years of experience in corporate consulting, that I was happy to contribute immediately if he needed me to. He cut me off, said they were very committed to diversity at Caldwell, that I'd find them very inclusive. The way he said the word diversity made my stomach drop, like it was charity, like I was there to fill a quota instead of being a consultant who'd been recruited by 3 different firms. I tried to push back a little. Told him I was actually recruited based on my track record, that last year I'd led the Morehouse deal that generated $42 million in revenue for my previous firm. Real numbers, real results. He just brushed it off, said something about how we'd see how I did with real pressure, already turning away from me, already done with the conversation. I didn't argue. I smiled. I nodded. I picked up my notebook and I thought about my grandmother. Grandma Esther had cleaned houses in Georgia for 40 years. White families, big houses with more rooms than she'd ever lived in. She used to tell me something when I was young. She'd say, when people underestimate you, that's when you're most dangerous. Let them think you small, baby, then show them how tall you really are. So I fetched the coffee. I took the notes. I smiled when Richard made those little comments about urban fashion when I wore gold jewelry, smiled when he asked if I was comfortable in client meetings with his older white clients, like maybe I'd be too intimidated or something. I watched him. I learned his patterns. I studied how the firm operated. And I made phone calls. See, what Richard Morrison didn't know about me was that I hadn't just worked my way up through consulting. My father, William Clark, had been one of the first black executives at Lehman Brothers before the collapse. Before he died when I was 19, he'd introduced me to every major player in New York finance. I'd had dinner with Warren Cartwright when I was 16. I spent a summer internship under Michelle Okonkwo, who now runs a billion-dollar hedge fund. My network wasn't just good, it was exceptional. The kind of network you can't buy and you can't fake. But more importantly, Richard didn't know about the trust fund. My grandmother hadn't just cleaned houses. She'd invested, slowly, carefully, wisely, for 60 years. When she died, she left me everything, $8 million. With one instruction written in her will in her own handwriting: build something they can't take from you, baby girl. I was 25 when I got that money. I spent 5 years turning $8 million into $42 million through careful investments, tech startups, real estate, private equity deals. Last year, when Caldwell and Associates was looking for capital after a messy partner buyout, my mentor Warren brought me the opportunity. He asked if I wanted to own a piece of one of Manhattan's top consulting firms. I bought 38% through a holding company I'd created called Greystone Capital, buried it under layers of paperwork, anonymous, untraceable, strategic. The existing partners had no idea who owned Greystone. They just knew someone had written a very large check and now controlled the biggest voting bloc in the company. I took the job at Caldwell not because I needed it. I took it because I wanted to see the firm from the inside before I made my next move. I wanted to understand the culture, the leadership, whether it was worth investing more or just walking away and letting someone else run it. Richard Morrison made that decision very, very easy for me. 3 weeks into my coffee-fetching tenure, Richard called me into his office. I knocked, portfolio in hand, ready for whatever degrading task he had lined up this time. He didn't even look up from his computer. Just told me he needed me to prepare materials for the board meeting next week. Just copies and binders, nothing complicated. Make sure the conference room was set up perfectly with fresh coffee ready by 8 a.m. sharp. I asked him to clarify. The board meeting. He sighed like I was a child asking why the sky was blue. Explained it was very important, lots of significant people attending, that I should really try not to mess it up. His tone made it clear he thought I probably would mess it up anyway. I asked who was on the board. Tried to sound casual about it. He rattled off the usual names: Thornton, McAdams, Reinhardt. Then he mentioned they'd had a new majority shareholder attending for the first time. Someone very important. Said we really needed to make a good impression because this person now controlled the biggest voting bloc in the company. Basically had the power to make or break careers. I told him I'd make sure everything was absolutely perfect. That night, I called Warren Cartwright. He picked up on the second ring, asked how Caldwell was treating me, that warm, grandfatherly tone in his voice. I told him about like I expected. Then I asked him about the private equity deal, about Greystone Capital purchasing 38% of Caldwell and Associates. There was this pause. Then Warren started laughing, that deep, genuine laugh that told me everything I needed to know. He asked if I was telling him I'd been working at my own firm for 3 weeks and nobody knew it, like he couldn't believe the audacity of it. I smiled there in the darkness of my apartment, told him nobody knew, and I wanted to keep it that way until the board meeting. Warren said he'd never seen anything like this in 40 years of finance, that my grandmother would be cackling from heaven right now. Then he asked what I was planning to do. I told him I was going to teach Richard Morrison what diversity really means. The morning of the board meeting, I arrived at 6 a.m., set up the conference room exactly the way Richard had demanded. Fresh coffee in that expensive machine they had, leather binders at each seat, with the quarterly reports printed on heavy cream paper, name cards at each place setting in this elegant calligraphy. At the head of the table, I placed a name card that simply said, Greystone Capital, majority shareholder. At 7:45, Richard arrived, looking sharp in this charcoal suit. He inspected my work with that critical eye, like he was actively looking for mistakes. Walked around the entire table, checked each binder, even ran his finger along the edge, looking for dust. Finally told me it was acceptable. Then he noticed the head of the table setup, asked who was sitting there. I told him, the majority shareholder. He said, good, then instructed me to make sure I wasn't in the room when they arrived. This was C-suite only. Said it like I might contaminate the air or something. I said, of course. Kept my face completely neutral. The board members started arriving at 7:59. James Thornton, 72, founder of Caldwell and Associates. Still tall and distinguished, with white hair and these sharp blue eyes. Patricia McAdams, 65, senior partner, the only woman who'd broken through their glass ceiling back in the 80s and never let them forget it. David Reinhardt, 58, the man whose acquisition had made Richard's whole career. Quiet but absolutely brilliant with numbers. They greeted Richard warmly, took their seats, made small talk about golf and vacation homes in the Hamptons. Richard was in his element, laughing at their jokes, already positioning himself as the natural leader of the conversation before the meeting even officially started. At exactly 8 a.m., I walked into the conference room and closed the door behind me. Richard looked up and his face flashed with annoyance, said my name with this exasperated tone, reminded me he told me this meeting was private. I said I knew. Then I walked right past him, past the confused faces of the board members, past the empty chair he'd clearly expected to take, and I sat down in the leather chair at the head of the table. The entire room went completely silent, like someone had pressed mute on the universe. I opened my leather portfolio and pulled out this stack of documents, slid them across that polished wood table to James Thornton, who was staring at me like I just materialized out of thin air. I said good morning to everyone, introduced myself as Jasmine Clark, founder and CEO of Greystone Capital, explained that as of 6 months ago, I owned 38% of Caldwell and Associates, making me the majority shareholder and the single largest voting member of this board. Richard's face went on this fascinating journey. Confusion first, like his brain couldn't process what his ears were hearing. Then disbelief, then this gray pallor that made him look suddenly very, very old. His mouth opened, but nothing came out. He just sat there watching his entire world collapse in real time. Patricia McAdams broke the silence, asked in this slow, measured voice, what exactly was happening right now? I smiled at her. I actually respected Patricia. My research had shown she'd built her career on pure merit and mentored several young women of color over the years, often fighting with the other partners to give them real opportunities. I told her what was happening was that for the past 6 weeks, I'd been working as a junior associate in this firm. Explained I wanted to see how Caldwell operated from the ground level before I made any major decisions about the direction of my investment. Wanted to know if the culture was worth saving or if I should just clean house. I turned to look directly at Richard. His hands were gripping the edge of the table so hard his knuckles had gone white. I asked him if he remembered what he said to me on my first day. He didn't answer. Couldn't. His throat was working, but no sound came out. I reminded him anyway. Told him he said they were very committed to diversity, that I should fetch coffee and take notes, that he couldn't throw me into the deep end because of how I got here. Let those last words hang in the air real heavy. Richard started to say he didn't mean it that way. His voice was shaking. I cut him off, told him he absolutely meant it exactly that way, kept my voice calm, cold, Said he saw a black woman and made assumptions. That he saw my credentials, my track record, my 8 years of experience, and dismissed all of it because it was easier for him to believe I was a charity case than to accept that I'd earned my seat at this table. I opened another folder and slid documents to each board member. Explained these were reports I'd compiled over the past 3 weeks. Retention rates for consultants of color at Caldwell. Client satisfaction scores broken down by team leader. Revenue generation compared to salary and promotion rates. Told them the data told a very interesting story. James Thornton was reading fast, his expression getting darker with each page. He looked up at Richard and asked if this was accurate. If Richard had really lost 7 associates of color in the past 18 months. Richard said weakly that the job wasn't for everyone, like that explained anything. I repeated his words back slowly. The job isn't for everyone. Said that was interesting, because according to exit interviews I'd accessed through my position as majority shareholder, 6 of those 7 associates cited hostile work environment and lack of advancement opportunities as their reasons for leaving. Told them 3 of them were now at competitor firms where they were absolutely thriving. One had just closed a $60 million deal at Blackstone last month. I stood up and walked slowly around the table. Richard's eyes followed me like a trapped animal watching a predator circle. I could see sweat starting to form at his hairline. His perfect silver hair didn't look so perfect anymore. I told them what was going to happen. Said effective immediately, I was restructuring the partnership agreements. Looked directly at Richard and told him he was being removed as senior partner. He'd be transitioning to an advisory role with no client contact and significantly reduced compensation while we conducted a full investigation into several complaints that had been filed with HR over the years but somehow never got properly addressed. Richard found his voice, said he couldn't do this, but there was no strength behind the words. He sounded like he was trying to convince himself more than anyone else. I told him I absolutely could do this. Explained I owned 38% of this firm. James owned 32%. Patricia owned 18%. David owned 12%. That meant I controlled the voting block. I had the power to do whatever I wanted with this company. But then I turned to James and Patricia and told them I didn't buy into Caldwell to burn it down. Explained I had bought in because this firm had real potential, that under the right leadership, Caldwell could be the most innovative, inclusive, and profitable consulting firm in New York. But that would only happen if we stopped treating diversity like a checkbox and started treating talent like talent, regardless of where it came from or what it looked like. Patricia was nodding slowly, her eyes moving between the documents in my face. James was still reading, his jaw tight, but I could see something like respect starting to form in his expression, like he was seeing me clearly for the first time. I laid out my proposal for restructuring, new hiring practices with blind resume reviews in the first round, transparent promotion criteria published internally so everyone knew exactly what they needed to do to advance, mentorship programs that actually had teeth and accountability instead of just being lip service, and most importantly, leadership that actually reflected the world we operated in and the clients we served. I sat back down at the head of the table and looked at Richard one final time, told him he said I should learn how things were done here, said I did learn, and now I was going to show him how things were going to be done from now on. Richard stood up so abruptly his chair scraped against the floor with this harsh sound that made everyone wince, said this was insane, that he'd given 20 years to this firm, that he'd built half the client relationships they had. I told him he'd be compensated accordingly. His severance package was very generous. He could leave with dignity, or he could make this ugly. But either way, his time as senior partner was finished. That decision was already made. He looked around the table desperately, searching for allies. James wouldn't meet his eyes. Patricia was still reading my reports with this deepening frown. David Reinhardt, who'd been silent this whole time, finally spoke up, said Richard's name quietly, almost sadly, told him to take the deal. Richard's face went through several shades of red. He grabbed his briefcase, knocked over his untouched coffee in the process, muttered something about lawyers and getting what he deserved, but his voice was shaking so bad you could barely understand him. He walked out and slammed the door hard enough to rattle the framed diplomas on the wall. The room stayed silent for a long moment. I could hear the coffee dripping onto the floor where Richard had spilled it, each drop loud in the quiet. Finally, James Thornton started laughing. Started slow, just a chuckle, but it built until his shoulders were shaking and tears were forming in his eyes. He said my name with this wonder in his voice, told me my grandmother would be very, very proud. I was surprised, asked if he knew Grandma Esther. He said he knew her, explained she'd cleaned his parents' house for 15 years, that she used to bring me with her sometimes when I was little. I'd sit at their kitchen table doing homework while she worked. He said she told him once that I was going to run the world someday. He shook his head like he still couldn't believe it, said he should have listened to her. Patricia finally spoke up, said she'd had her suspicions something was wrong in Richard's division, but she'd never seen the full picture laid out like this. Asked if I was serious about the restructuring or if this was just about getting revenge. I told her I was completely serious. Explained I didn't spend $42 million on this firm just to watch it die from the inside. I wanted Caldwell to succeed, but it had to change. The old boys club wasn't just morally wrong anymore, it was bad business. The best talent was walking out the door because they couldn't see a future here, and our competitors were eating our lunch because of it. David spoke up, said he'd noticed the retention problem, but Richard always explained it away. People just couldn't handle the pressure, Richard would say. David asked what I needed from the existing partners to make this work. I told them I needed their support publicly and their honesty privately. If they saw problems, they needed to speak up instead of looking the other way because it was uncomfortable. I needed them to actually mentor the young associates instead of just using them for grunt work. And I needed them to trust that bringing in different perspectives would make us all more money, not less. The meeting continued for another 2 hours. We outlined everything in detail. Patricia would take over as interim senior partner while we searched for someone permanent, someone who actually understood what leadership meant in the 21st century. I'd joined the board officially and worked directly with HR to overhaul every policy, from hiring to promotion to client assignments. We'd implement quarterly reviews of teen culture with anonymous feedback, bring in an outside consultant to audit our practices, and we'd make it clear, both internally and to the industry, that Caldwell and Associates was entering a new era. When I finally left the building that evening, the sun was setting over Manhattan, painting all those glass towers gold and orange. I walked past Richard's old office. Melissa was in there helping pack up his things. When she saw me, she just stared for a moment. Then she smiled, a real smile, the kind that says, "Thank you," without needing any words. I took the subway home that night instead of calling a car. Sat there in my navy suit, the same one I'd worn on my first day, and thought about my grandmother. Thought about all those houses she cleaned, all those families who probably never even knew her name, who saw her as invisible. She told me once, late at night when I was studying for my college entrance exams, that she didn't clean houses just because she had to. I mean, she did have to, but that wasn't the point. She said she cleaned houses because every time she walked into one of those big homes, she was learning how rich people talked, how they thought, how they made decisions. She said she was invisible to them, and that was her superpower, because invisible people see everything. She told me she was building something through me, that every dollar she saved and invested was a brick and a foundation I'd build on someday. She said the best revenge against people who underestimated you wasn't anger. It was success so undeniable they had to choke on it. I pulled out my phone and looked at the only photo I had of her. She was standing in front of a house 3 times the size of anywhere she'd ever lived, wearing her cleaning uniform, smiling that knowing smile she always had. Like she could see the future, and she knew it was going to be good. I whispered thank you to her image on that screen. The next morning, I arrived at Caldwell at 7 a.m. just like always, but this time, I didn't go to the associate bullpen. I went to the executive floor. Went to the corner office that had been Richard's, the one with those floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Central Park. The nameplate on the door had already been changed. It said, Jasmine Clark, board member and strategic director. I sat down in that leather chair with the morning light streaming through the windows and opened my laptop. I had work to do, real work, the kind I'd been trained for, the kind I was built for. My phone buzzed. Text from Marcus Chen. He said he'd heard what happened, that everyone had heard. Said he wanted to thank me for what I was doing. Told me he almost quit 3 times in the past month because of how Richard treated the associates, especially the ones who didn't look like him. Said now he actually wanted to stay. I texted back telling him we had a lot of work to do, asked if he wanted to be part of the restructuring committee. He responded in seconds, yes. Over the next few weeks, word spread through the firm. Some of the older partners were resistant at first, uncomfortable with the changes, with having to actually justify their decisions and mentor their teams instead of just barking orders. A few of them left. I didn't stop them. But something interesting started happening. The associates who'd been quiet, who'd been going through the motions, suddenly came alive, started bringing ideas to meetings, started staying late not because they had to, but because they wanted to. The retention rate in the first month after Richard left was 100%. Not a single associate quit. And the clients noticed, started commenting on how much sharper our presentations were, how much more innovative our solutions had become. 3 clients who'd been considering leaving renewed their contracts. We picked up 2 new major accounts in the first quarter. Patricia pulled me aside one afternoon, about 6 weeks after the board meeting, told me she'd been at Caldwell for 30 years and she'd never seen morale this high. Said she owed me an apology because she'd seen the problems but hadn't done enough to fix them. She'd told herself it wasn't her job, that she had to pick her battles. She said watching me refuse to accept that, watching me actually do something about it, had reminded her why she got into this business in the first place. I told her it wasn't about blame. It was about doing better going forward. 6 months after I sat down at the head of that table, Caldwell & Associates posted record profits. We'd grown our client base by 22%. Our employee satisfaction scores had gone from bottom quartile in the industry to top 10%. And we'd been named one of the best places to work for diverse talent by 3 different business publications. Richard tried to sue, claimed wrongful termination and breach of contract. His lawyers sent all these threatening letters, tried to claim I'd somehow frauded the board or that my purchase of the Greystone shares was improper. Warren called me laughing when he heard about it, told me Richard's lawyers dropped the case within a week once they actually looked at the paperwork. Everything I'd done was completely legal and completely airtight. Richard had no case. He was just angry and embarrassed and looking for someone to blame besides himself. I heard through the industry grapevine that Richard had trouble finding another senior position. Turns out when you build a reputation for creating hostile work environments and losing top talent, other firms notice. He eventually took a job at a much smaller firm in Connecticut. Significant step down. I didn't celebrate his failure, but I didn't feel sorry for him either. Sometimes I think about that first day, standing in that marble lobby in my carefully saved fursuit, watching Richard walk past me like I was furniture. I think about how small he tried to make me feel, how invisible he wanted me to be. And then I think about his face when I sat down at the head of that table. The shock, the disbelief, the moment he realized he'd underestimated me so completely that he'd literally been working for me while treating me like I wasn't worth his time. My grandmother used to say, the universe has a sense of humor. She said sometimes the best thing you can do is let people show you who they are. Let them underestimate you. Let them dismiss you. Because when you finally show them who you really are, the reversal is so complete they never recover from it. Richard Morrison called me a diversity hire and told me to fetch coffee. He thought he was putting me in my place. He thought he was teaching me how things worked in his world. Instead, I taught him that his world was already gone. He just hadn't noticed yet. Have you ever been underestimated because of how you looked? Share your story below, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories of powerful women getting the respect they deserve.